In a world that often demands justice, sometimes the most powerful choice you can make is mercy. Explore the complex stories of forgiveness and the incredible strength it takes to let go of the past. Subscribe now to experience these deeply moving human dramas.
You need to understand what happened in that house, and why I will never apologize for what I did next. For 43 years, I was the kind of woman who disappears into her own life. I cooked. I cleaned. I raised 2 children, kept the books for my husband Gerald's plumbing business, drove to every school play and every Saturday soccer game in a minivan that smelled like grass clippings and fast food. I did not ask for much. I did not need much. I had Gerald, I had my home, and I had the particular satisfaction of a woman who knows exactly where everything is, in the pantry, in the filing cabinet, in the hearts of the people she loves. Gerald died on a Tuesday in March. Pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. I am not going to tell you about grief. You either know it or you don't, and no words I have will make you understand what it is to wake up on a Wednesday morning and reach across a cold bed for the second time in your life. The first time being practice, the second time being the real thing. I will only say this: grief does not announce itself in dramatic moments. It arrives in the produce section of the grocery store when you instinctively reach for 2 bananas instead of 1. My daughter and her husband moved in 3 weeks after the funeral. They presented it as concern. My daughter stood in my kitchen, Gerald's kitchen, the kitchen where I had canned tomatoes every August since 1987, and she said, "Mom, we don't think you should be alone right now." She looked at her husband when she said it, just a quick sideways glance, and I filed that glance away somewhere in the back of my mind the way you file away a receipt you're not sure you'll need. I said thank you. I made up the guest room. I told myself this was what family did. That was my first mistake. Not the only one, but the first. My son-in-law's name is not important. What is important is the way he walked through my home. Slowly, with his hands in his pockets, pausing in doorways the way a contractor pauses when he's calculating square footage. He was an account manager at a logistics company in Charlotte. He wore fleece vests on weekends. He had opinions about property values and what the market was doing in this part of Georgia, and he shared these opinions frequently and without invitation. My daughter had always been practical. Even as a girl, she was the one who saved her birthday money and made lists. I loved that about her. I had raised her to be capable and unsentimental, and she was, and I had not fully understood until that spring that unsentimental could curdle, under the right conditions, into something harder. 6 weeks after they moved in, my son-in-law sat me down at my own kitchen table. "We've been talking," he said, "and we think it makes the most sense, financially, if we just formalize the arrangement." I did not understand at first. I asked him what arrangement he meant. "The house," my daughter said. She was standing at the counter, not sitting, and she was looking at the window, not at me. "It's a lot for one person, Mom. And you know Dad didn't leave things." She paused. The business had debts. This was true. Gerald had not been a careful businessman. He had been a generous one, which is a different thing entirely. He'd given discounts to people who couldn't pay. He'd carried customers on the books for months. When he died, the business died with him. And yes, there were debts. And yes, I had known about them. And yes, the savings account was smaller than I had let myself admit out loud. But the house was paid for. Gerald had made sure of that. "At least you'll always have the roof," he used to say. And I had believed him. And I had believed we both understood what that meant. "We think," my son-in-law said, "that if you signed the house over to us, jointly, all 3 of us, we could refinance, use the equity, take care of the debts, and you'd still be living here. Nothing would change day to day." I looked at my daughter. She looked at the window. "I'd like to think about it," I said. "Of course," he said, and smiled, and that smile was the second thing I filed away. I did not tell anyone what they had asked. I am a private person by nature, and I was raised by a woman who believed that family business stayed inside the family walls. But I found myself, in the weeks that followed, unable to sleep past 4 in the morning. I would lie in the dark and run the numbers in my head. The debts. The Social Security check, which barely covered utilities and groceries. The house, which was the only thing standing between me and a situation I refused to name directly. I started going through Gerald's things. Not because I was looking for anything. I told myself I was just organizing. Gerald had a roll-top desk in the corner of the spare bedroom that we'd always called the study. Despite the fact that neither of us had ever really studied in it, he kept everything in that desk. Receipts, warranties for appliances we'd replaced years ago, birthday cards. A coffee-stained copy of a book about trout fishing he'd bought in 1999 and never read. In the bottom left drawer, underneath a folder of old tax returns, there was a manila envelope. It had my name on it in Gerald's handwriting. Not Eleanor, not Mom. Just my name, full the way he wrote it on birthday cards and the occasional love note left on the refrigerator. The way that meant, this is for you specifically, not for the household, not for anyone else. I sat down on the floor of that study, and I held the envelope for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten, 4 pages, dated 8 months before his diagnosis. A separate sealed envelope he'd labeled "Open this" at the bank, "Ask for Helen Marsh." A photograph of the two of us on our honeymoon in Savannah, which I hadn't seen in years, and a key, small and silver, with a number stamped on the bow, 447. I read the letter twice. Then I sat on the floor of that study for another hour. Gerald had not been a careful businessman, but he had been, it turned out, a careful husband. He had written, "I know I am not always good with money. I know you have worried about this more than you've ever said to me, and I know you have covered for me in 100 ways I probably never properly thanked you for. So I did something. I did it a long time ago when things were good, and I kept it separate because I wanted it to be yours. Not the business's, not the children's, not mine. Yours. In case you ever needed a door." The sealed envelope contained account numbers, a name, and a note confirming that Gerald had, over the course of 22 years, quietly contributed to a financial account held in my name only. He'd started it the year after our daughter was born. He'd added to it when he could, small amounts, irregular, nothing that would be noticed in the household accounts he managed. He had told no one. The key was to a safe deposit box at the First Southern Bank branch on Magnolia Street, and Helen Marsh had been Gerald's contact there since 1998. I did not call my daughter. I got dressed, drove to the bank, and asked for Helen Marsh. Helen Marsh was 61, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the particular competence of a woman who has watched a great many people receive difficult news across her desk. She had known Gerald for over 2 decades. When I told her he'd passed, she removed her glasses and pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. And for a moment she wasn't a banker. She was just a person who had lost someone she'd known. Then she put her glasses back on. The safe deposit box contained 3 things. A brokerage account statement showing a balance that made me sit very still for a very long time. A document from Gerald's attorney, and a handwritten list of instructions in Gerald's shorthand. The same compressed notes he'd left on the whiteboard in his office. Half abbreviations, half drawings, fully decipherable only to someone who had lived with him for 43 years. I had lived with him for 43 years. The brokerage account was in my name, had been in my name since 2003. Gerald had not told me because, he wrote in the letter, you would have insisted on using it for something practical. This was meant to be impractical. This was meant to be yours. I drove home and I sat in the driveway for a while. The azaleas Gerald had planted along the front walk were starting to come in, the way they did every April, reliable as a clock, red and pink, and completely indifferent to the fact that their planter was gone. I thought about what I was going to do. I did not tell my daughter about the envelope. I want to be honest about the next part, because I have had people ask me since whether I was being deceptive, whether I was playing games, whether what I did was vindictive. I was not playing games. I was a 67-year-old woman sitting in a house that my daughter and son-in-law had already begun, in subtle ways, to treat as their own. I was a woman whose husband had left her a key and said, "Here is a door," and I was trying to decide, very carefully, whether to walk through it. I met with Gerald's attorney, a man named, well, it does not matter what his name was. What matters is that he was thorough and clear-eyed and told me in plain language what I owned, what I was entitled to, and what signing that house over would have meant. You would have had no legal claim, he said. A verbal promise to continue living there is not binding. You would have been a guest in your own home. I sat with that word for a moment. Guest. All right, I said. Then here's what I'd like to do. I will not pretend the next several months were easy. I was still living in that house with my daughter and son-in-law while I quietly did what I needed to do. I attended Gerald's church on Sundays. I cooked dinners. I asked about my son-in-law's job and listened to the answers. I did not sign anything. My son-in-law grew frustrated. He had a way of rephrasing the same request. The house, the equity, the refinancing. As though the problem was that I hadn't understood him correctly the first time, and if he just found the right combination of words I would come around. He never raised his voice. He was never rude, not exactly. He was persistent in the way that water is persistent. Patient, constant, wearing. My daughter, for her part, stopped meeting my eyes at dinner. In September, my son-in-law sat me down again. "We've found a place," he said, he meant for me. "A one-bedroom apartment in a senior community 40 minutes away. It would be more appropriate for your needs," he said, "and it would let us make the changes to the property that would really maximize." "I'd like to think about it," I said. Again. "Mom." My daughter finally looked at me. Her face had an expression I had never seen on it before, something that lived between guilt and impatience, and the impatience was winning. "This isn't reasonable. You're alone in a 5-bedroom house." "We're trying to be practical," I said. "Your father's name is on the deed, and so is mine. Dad is gone," my son-in-law said. "Yes," I said, "he is." That was all I said. I got up and went to bed. In October, I flew to Asheville. This requires some explanation. Gerald, in his letter, had mentioned that a college friend of his, a man he'd known since freshman orientation, a man who had spent 40 years in real estate development in western North Carolina, had once made an offer on a piece of property Gerald owned outright. A parcel of land outside Asheville, 11 acres, that Gerald had purchased in 1994 on what he'd called a hunch, and what I had called a completely inexplicable decision made without consulting me. He had paid $9,000 for it. He had never done anything with it. I had forgotten it existed. It was now, according to Gerald's attorney, worth considerably more than $9,000. The development had moved west. The area had grown. There were breweries and art galleries and young couples from Atlanta buying property. The 11 acres sat at the edge of all of that expansion, and it had been sitting there for 30 years appreciating quietly, like a secret Gerald had planted in the ground. The meeting in Asheville lasted 2 hours. I flew home with a folder in my carry-on bag that I did not take out until I was sitting in my own kitchen at 6 in the morning, coffee in hand, the house still quiet around me. I opened the folder. I read the numbers again to make sure I hadn't misremembered them. I hadn't. I sat there for a while in the early light in Gerald's kitchen, and I let myself feel something I hadn't felt since March. Not quite happiness, but something in the same family, something like, all right then. I found the apartment myself. Not the senior community my son-in-law had identified, a place that smelled of institutional cleaning products and premature resignation. What I found was a unit in a converted warehouse building in downtown Decatur, Georgia, 12 minutes from my daughter's best friend, and 3 blocks from a farmer's market I had always wanted to be closer to. High ceilings, big windows, a small terrace where I could see the tree line. The building had a waiting list. I got on it in November. I told my daughter and son-in-law in January that I had decided to move. My son-in-law looked at me with an expression I can only describe as recalibration. The look of someone who has been playing a very long game and has suddenly realized the board is arranged differently than he thought. "Where?" he asked. I told him. I gave him the building name, the neighborhood, nothing more. He stopped. "That's not cheap." "No," I said. "Mom," my daughter said slowly, "how are you?" "I have things in order," I said. "I'm fine. I'll be out by the end of February." I was out by the 22nd. I want to tell you about the first morning in my apartment. I had a mattress on the floor of the bedroom because the bed frame hadn't been delivered yet. I had a coffee maker on the kitchen counter and nothing else. The movers had brought the boxes, but I hadn't unpacked anything except the coffee maker, the mugs, and the photograph of Gerald and me in Savannah. I made coffee. I stood at the big window in the living room. The sun came in at an angle that was entirely different from the angle it had come in at in Gerald's house. And everything looked strange and new in the way that things look when you have not yet learned how to see them. I was 67 years old. I was standing in an apartment I had chosen, in a neighborhood I had chosen, in a life that was, for the first time in 43 years, organized entirely around my own preferences. I was terrified. I was free. These were the same feeling. My daughter called 4 times in March. We spoke twice. The conversations were polite and brief and carefully surfaced. 2 people skimming across water neither of them wanted to fall into. She asked how I was settling in. I said fine. She asked if I needed anything. I said I was managing. She did not ask about money. My son-in-law did not call. In April they found out about the land sale. I don't know exactly how. The sale had closed in March. The proceeds had moved into accounts that were mine alone, and I had not told anyone. But people talk. Gerald's attorney had an office manager who had been to high school with someone my daughter knew, or something along those lines. The particular geometry of small towns and extended networks that collapses distance faster than you expect. My daughter called on a Tuesday evening. Mom. Her voice was different. The careful politeness was gone. And what replaced it was something rawer, something that I recognized from when she was 16 and had been caught in a lie. A kind of frantic renegotiation. Someone told us, I heard that, the land in Asheville, the property Dad had. Yes, I said. You sold it? I did. Silence. Then, Mom, that was a family asset. I put down my coffee cup. That land was in your father's name, which transferred to me. It was not a family asset. It was our asset. Mine now, we could have discussed. When? I said. And I let the words sit there for a moment. When were we going to discuss it? Before or after you showed me the senior community with the industrial carpet. She didn't say anything. I'm not angry, I said, and I meant it, mostly. I'm not calling to rehash anything. I just want us to be honest about what happened, because I think we've spent several months being very polite and not very honest, and I'm too old to keep doing that. She cried. A little, briefly, the way people cry when they've been caught not being who they want to be. I listened. I did not rush to fill the silence with reassurance. When she was done, I said, I would like to see you. I would like to have dinner with you without your husband and talk, just talk. Not about money, not about the house, not about the land. Just talk like we used to. Another silence. Shorter this time. Okay, she said. Okay. When? We met at a restaurant in Decatur on a Thursday in May. My daughter came alone. She looked like herself again, or closer to it. Not the woman who had stood at my kitchen counter staring out the window while her husband talked about equity, but the girl who had sat at my kitchen table at 17 doing calculus homework with the same expression of absolute concentration she'd had since she was old enough to hold a pencil. We ordered. We talked. She told me things about her marriage that I had suspected and had not asked about. I told her things about those months in the house that she said she had not fully understood at the time. Neither of us was entirely innocent. I had been passive where I should have been direct. She had been willfully unobservant. These were different failures, but they were both failures, and we sat with that over good food in a decent restaurant and did not try to resolve anything too quickly. Before the check came, she looked at me and said, I didn't know about the accounts. I didn't know Dad had done any of that. I know, I said. He never told me. He told me, I said. Eventually. That was enough. She was quiet for a moment. Are you happy in the apartment? I thought about the mornings, the angle of the light, the farmer's market 3 blocks away, the terrace where I'd been putting out a bird feeder, slowly, methodically, the way you do when you have time and no one is rushing you. Yes, I said, I really am. My son-in-law called twice in June. I did not answer. He left messages that were carefully worded, walking a line between apology and inquiry that told me everything I needed to know about what he actually wanted. I did not return the calls. I discussed this with my daughter at our second dinner, in July, and she said she understood. She said she was working on some things. I said I believed her, and I did. Life at 67, in an apartment with high ceilings and morning light, and a terrace I was slowly turning into a garden, was not the life I had expected. It was smaller in square footage and larger in everything else. I had a book club that met on the second Tuesday of every month. I had a neighbor across the hall, a retired schoolteacher named, well, she knows who she is, who brought me tomatoes from her garden and asked nothing in return, which I was learning, for the second time in my life, to receive gracefully. Gerald had left me a key. He'd called it a door, and it was, and I had walked through it, and I was not going to apologize for what was on the other side. Sometimes, standing on the terrace in the early morning with my coffee, I think about the way he used to say, at least you'll always have the roof. And I think, no, better. I have a different roof now, one I chose, one no one can take from me. That is enough. That is more than enough. It is, in fact, exactly what I needed all along. I just didn't know yet that I was allowed to want it.